Hi everyone and welcome. The primary goal of this video lecture is to help you think more thematically about the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment philosophs. If you're anything like me, you might find this chapter to be a running list of snobby dead dudes and their elitist ideas, and not so much these ideas of the ladies. But for better or for worse, it turns out that these guys are pretty much responsible for how our society and institutions function today. We can thank them for things like our natural rights protected by the law, our belief that everyone should be educated, a pretty progressive criminal punishment system, and my ability to openly criticize them for their intense racism and misogyny. Thanks, philosophs. So they're worth studying not only for those positive contributions, but at least for me, it's important to study them to better understand the challenges we still face today as a civilization. All right, first a quick overview of today's topics. First, we'll explore the links between the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Second, the Enlightenment reinterpretation of human nature and the human mind. Third, the debate among philosophers about the institution of government. Fourth, a real quick look at the impact on religion. 5, how the Enlightenment ideas were spread to encourage a more general shift in worldview. And finally, a closer look at issues of gender, class, and race in the Enlightenment. So first, let's discuss the origins of the Enlightenment. As you know, the Enlightenment refers to a period of intense questioning of humanity, society, and human institutions like government and religion, and the proposal of new ideas in those same fields. If we want to think more long-term, it's likely that it has its origins all the way back in the European Renaissance and the Reformation, which revived a celebration of learning through liberal arts, celebrated humanist belief in man's potential, and provoked a questioning of deep-rooted institutions that held a monopoly on truth, like the church. Of course, the age of exploration and ongoing colonization of the world led Europeans to ask really important questions like, why is that human dressed like that? And what is this crazy-looking animal? But giving specific shape and form to the Enlightenment was undoubtedly the scientific revolution. The most significant contribution of the scientific revolution to our modern perception of the world is empiricism, or the idea that things can be truly understood by studying them with reason, objectivity, and observation. More than any single scientific discovery, empiricism shaped how we approach truth because it asserts that our minds are capable of using reason and logic, of understanding the world around us, and including the world that's very far away from us. Rather than turning to authorities of the church or to classical writers of Greece and Rome, scientists and philosophers of the 18th century relied on their own capacity to reason about the things they observed in order to understand them. The scientific revolution also led more generally to an increased questioning of previously held truths, in shattering Aristotelian concepts of the universe and promoting skepticism about religious conformity. Classical thinkers in the church were approached with a more skeptical attitude. But as we're going to see, there were certain truths that European male scientists and philosophers were completely unwilling to challenge, namely their own superiority over other cultures and genders. In fact, they'll just use science to reinforce those old assumptions, but more on that to come. Enlightenment philosophers, or philosophs of the 18th century, adapted this fundamental shift in how we understand the natural world of plants, animals, and the solar system, and applied it to human nature, society, and human institutions. In other words, you might think of the Enlightenment philosophs as those that were mopping up all previous understanding of human nature, society, and politics from before the scientific revolution and re-examining them through an empirical lens. They were fundamental to the broader paradigm shift that we've been discussing. And most importantly, in applying the scientific method to questions about the human mind, society, and institutions, the philosophers embraced the idea that those things could all be constantly improved into the future, or the idea of progress. This was a distinct break from the Renaissance view that the classical past was the pinnacle of human achievement. Progress towards improving humanity in the future was the goal. That progress began with a re-examination of human nature and how the human mind worked. As we've seen from studying political theory, concepts of human nature have a direct impact on the views of institutions like government. Absolutists like Jacques Bossuet and Thomas Hobbes both held the belief that humans were born with sin, greed, and a likeliness to do harm to others unless their wills were controlled by an all-powerful government. That's going to be challenged in the Enlightenment by philosophers like John Locke, David Hume, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his essay concerning human understanding, John Locke claimed that the development of the human mind is determined solely by life experiences. Human nature, or the state of a human at birth, was a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. Living in poverty, without education, without the security of good government, it would be quite natural for a human to display traits of greed, superstition, and aggression. Locke would base all his calls for institutional reforms off of the theory of human nature, or sensationalism. Locke's going to argue that human social institutions, like education, religion, and government, needed to take responsibility for shaping the human experience to produce men and women who were rational. The civilizing influences of these institutions transformed humans from animals to rational men. While Scottish Enlightenment thinker David Hume would agree with Locke's basic premise of sensationalism, he took that principle of human nature a step further to challenge some of the basic assumptions of most of the philosophers. Because he argued that our sensory experiences are the only way to establish what is real, only that which could be verified by our senses could be true. Therefore, human reason, or our ability to draw conclusions from our experiences, was useless. More generally, Hume's ideas pose a significant challenge to debates about God and religion. Finally, another voice in the debate about human nature is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was a rather late Enlightenment thinker, and he's considered by many historians to actually not be part of the Enlightenment at all. This is namely because he believed that the state of man and nature ought to be preserved. In other words, human institutions, and all human civilization for that matter, corrupted the basic goodness of the individual. He rejected the Enlightenment impulse to apply rational thinking to understanding humanity, instead embracing man's natural emotional impulses. In opposition to Locke, Rousseau celebrated man's animalistic nature and promoted the idea that men could be a noble savage. For most of the Enlightenment, it was Locke's perception of human nature that had the most influence. While today we might be more likely to admit that certain genetic traits shape the mind at birth, we still would fundamentally agree that humans are improved by positive life environments. Therefore, subsequent philosophers embraced Locke's call to question established institutions and redesign them for the improvement of the human experience. The primary institution at the heart of the Enlightenment debates was, of course, government. It's a bit ironic that France was the geographic heart of the Enlightenment, given the effectiveness of its absolute government, but there are a few important reasons for this. First, Louis XIV had effectively made French an international language of educated elites, so they all flocked to the salons of Paris to share their views. From Paris, the philosophers sparked a republic of letters, or an international written conversation among philosophers across Europe. But of great importance to the growing dislike of French absolute monarchy under Louis XIV's successor, Louis XV. Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Beccaria became important voices in calling for the limitations of absolute monarchy. Concerned more with aristocratic life at Versailles than strengthening the French state as Louis XIV had done, the reign of Louis XV provoked thinkers like Montesquieu to challenge absolutism. Given the monarchy's censorship at the time, Montesquieu had to critique absolutism through satire. This was most famously done in his work, The Persian Letters, which presented fictitious observations of European culture through the eyes of two Persian travelers. It was a scathing critique of Louis XV and the superstitions of Catholic society. Following that work, Montesquieu then outlined his ideas of a reformed political institution in the spirit of the law. This text argued that the preservation of human liberty could only be achieved through checks on government tyranny, or a separation of political powers. Political power, he argued, had to be divided among multiple bodies, as was the case in England, where power had been shared between king and parliament. This probably sounds familiar to you, given our own government is structured this way. Montesquieu did not wholly challenge the existence of a monarch, and actually none of the philosophers really did. This is definitely not the age of republicanism and democracy yet. Like others, Montesquieu simply wished to curb absolute monarchy, which so easily led to tyranny and despotism. Voltaire would push for the same, but instead by directly encouraging monarchs to be more reform-minded and apply their powers to the improvement of their subjects' lives. Considering himself more practical than Montesquieu, he believed that the best institutional change one could hope for is a monarch who desired to serve the common good and was himself enlightened. That's a monarch butterfly, but it's blue. According to Voltaire, the most effective reforms a monarch could institute were the freedom of religion and expression. By allowing subjects legal religious toleration and the ability to openly critique the ruler could best respond to their needs while preserving their liberties. Voltaire had a great influence on the absolute rulers of Prussia and Russia who did use their absolute authority to push for social reforms such as religious toleration. Finally, Beccaria also encouraged absolute rulers to promote reforms that improved the lives of subjects. He focused primarily on reforming the penal system and on crimes and punishments. Embracing Locke's sensationalism, he would encourage governments to reform social institutions to prevent men from becoming criminals, rather than using torture, imprisonment, or capital punishment to deter crimes. This, too, was embraced by the monarchs of Eastern Europe, but perhaps primarily as a way to limit the power of the nobility to punish their serfs. Of course, there were more revolutionary calls to change political institutions, and we've seen how Locke's second treatise of civil government was put into practice in England after the Glorious Revolution. Locke's version of the social contract made the law, or the Constitution, sovereign over all else. The legislative body and the people were both obligated to serve and protect the law to ensure that life, liberty, and property were protected. However, a different interpretation of the social contract would be proposed by Rousseau in his creatively named work, The Social Contract. In it, he proposed that it wasn't the law that was sovereign, but the general will of the governed people. In other words, sovereignty was popular, or from the will of the people. While later political theorists would use Rousseau's concepts of the general will and popular sovereignty to justify a democracy, or voting as a way to gauge the will of the people, that was not Rousseau's idea. Rather, Rousseau believed that a far-seeing minority could run the government in ways that served the general will. To put this really simply, Rousseau proposed that government should serve the people, not the other way around. Of course, all these new political ideas rejected divine right absolutism, or the idea that monarchy's purpose was to serve God. The Enlightenment might not have rejected monarchy outright, but it did reject the influence of religion in government. This broadly reflects a secularization of society, but not the rejection of religion as a whole. Enlightenment philosophers rejected religious institutions that were based on what they perceived to be superstition rather than reason, but they didn't reject the existence of God. So by secularization, what we really mean is that religious rituals were removed from the culture of everyday life. For these thinkers, God was not an omnipotent, omnipresent force that required daily acknowledgement. Many philosophers became deists, and deism was the belief that God's role in human existence was that of a clockmaker who created the universe and all of its beings and set it in motion and then left it to operate, even chocolate. This promoted the idea that God was a rational creator and that man could empirically study God's creation to understand the laws upon which it operated. Philosophers rarely question the existence of God or human superiority in God's creation. In fact, like Newton, they saw their rational approach to understanding humanity as a great service to God. Intellectual achievements and compiling of knowledge therefore glorified God's creation. In many ways, this is what made the encyclopedia so revolutionary. Mackay calls the encyclopedia, which we most credit to Denis Diderot, the philosoph's greatest and most representative intellectual achievement. It compiled entries from experts across many fields and openly challenged the institutions of the day. In creating this widely read resource for the dissemination of knowledge, you might think of the encyclopedia as sort of the Enlightenment Bible. Diderot himself wanted to use the encyclopedia to change the general way of thinking, which embraces the fundamental idea that knowledge promoted critical thinking. The encyclopedia was one of many ways in which the ideas of the Enlightenment began to spread among literate circles of elites in Europe. As it spread from Paris, the Enlightenment took slightly unique characteristics in other countries, but the most essential to the creation of the Republic of Letters was the salon. Salons were private meetings held in the homes of elites that invited prominent thinkers of the day to engage in debates about all the issues that we've been talking about. What was significant about the list of invitees is that they spanned noble and middle-class social circles really for the first time ever. It was the first opportunity educated middle classes, or the French bourgeoisie, had to influence the thinking of the traditional aristocracy, and they did. Don't get me wrong, these members of the middle class were super rich and super elite, but their backgrounds made them more critical of traditional social structures and institutions. Yes, sir in the middle, do you have a question? Yes, you can go to the bathroom. However, since salons were reserved for the elite, other public spaces had to become sites of Enlightenment debate, if the ideas of the philosophers are going to change the broader worldview. Coffee houses were one of those spaces where issues of the day could be debated in public among members of a broader middle class. At the coffee house, literate members of society could read newspapers and debate politics without having to be invited to a salon. Coffee generally promoted more intellectual discussion than the drinks served at taverns do. Let that be a life lesson to you. And finally, an explosion of printed text and increased literacy led to a general reading revolution. The sheer limit on the number of books prior to the 18th century meant that even among literate groups, books were read by one person out loud. The communal nature of reading created the idea that reading was a one-way dissemination of knowledge from the reader to the listener. But as more people could afford readily available books, reading became personal and changed the reader's relationship to the book. Individual readers were now critical readers, and they could discuss their individual interpretations of the text with one another. Both coffee houses and the reading revolution created an important historical concept, for historians at least, which is the public sphere. Rather than education and intellectual debate being private and limited to elites, as it had been for all of history, public spaces were now infused with the ideas about politics, religion, or economics. And it was no longer off limits for members of the public to discuss these topics. So it's only going to be a matter of time before the common person demanded their right to do so and to allow their ideas to influence their institutions. However, understanding the public sphere of the 18th century also points to some important limitations of the Enlightenment and its impacts on European society. I already mentioned how philosophers may have wanted to challenge religious and political institutions, but they hardly questioned given social norms about gender, class, and race. Take the dominant perceptions about women, for example, which remained undoubtedly misogynistic. Philosophers did not question the cultural assumption that women were intellectually inferior to men and should remain outside the newly created public sphere. Rousseau's ideas about women show that philosophers used their new embrace of human nature to further ostracize women from intellectual circles in public life. Rousseau argued that nature made women subordinate to men, and therefore they should play a passive role. Scientific studies in physiology also serve to reinforce these assumptions, rather than empirically challenge them. As always, elite women could challenge women's norms, but we have to remember that they were exceptions. Madame du Châtelet, for example, wrote and published in the sciences and asserted that the sole limitation on women's participation was their lack of education. But even she was excluded from the Royal Academy of Sciences because she was a woman. Women could be salon hostesses or salonières, which was actually quite an influential role. Without the salonière, the Enlightenment wouldn't have been nearly as influential. They determined who was invited, what was discussed, and they even influenced the tastes of the philosophers by decorating the spaces with Rococo art. Therefore, they were essential to the intellectual unity between the aristocracy and the upper middle classes and the Republic of Letters. But even when they encouraged men at salons to debate the role of women in society, they couldn't personally participate in those discussions. Even elite women were very much on the sidelines. And what about general views of the common person? Although philosophers believed that reforming institutions could improve the lives of the peasants or urban workers, they rejected the idea that common people should directly influence those institutions. Again, we're still far away from democracy. If anything, philosophers saw the common man as a child in need of parenting and their educational guidance. Therefore, the Enlightenment was also used to reinforce old assumptions about class and social power. Finally, the dangerous side of empirical thinking and the assumptions about elites comes out most powerfully in new ideas about race. As we explored in class, the empirical desire to compartmentalize and classify all things led people like Linnaeus to redefine race on observable biological characteristics. Concepts of race always existed, but now they were solidified upon supposed scientific facts. These scientific facts were only used to reinforce, not to challenge, established assumptions about European superiority. The racial hierarchy developed became justification for the expansion of 18th century slavery. So, maybe like me, you're torn about the scientific revolution and Enlightenment. In so many ways, it represents a significant turning point in history. The idea that humans are shaped by the quality of their environment and are fundamentally rational beings is a cornerstone of our culture, and the idea that governments ought to serve the needs of the people and limit their powers to uplift society will lead directly to the promotion of human rights and that need to be protected under the law. But at the same time, the scientific revolution and Enlightenment reflects continuities with older assumptions about race, class, and gender. The philosophers may have changed the ways they articulated the superiority of elite European men, but the fundamental idea that elite European men were superior certainly rested on much older traditions.